Sit down, you guys. Yes, it's working. Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's really my pleasure to be up here today. I'm Elaine Stafford from DRG, Undersea Consulting. I know a lot of you, but not all of you. The topic of our panel this morning is cables for a changing tomorrow. We've got a really good group of people here today. A lot of you may remember, several of them were up here last year as well. I need to get this down. I usually like to start these panels with a joke to lighten things up. But honestly, I didn't find a joke. So I'm going to read you something that I thought was interesting. I don't know whether you'll see a little bit of humor in it. A good forecaster is no smarter than anyone else. He merely has his ignorance better organized. I guess that fell flat. Sorry about that. Well, my goal today is to kind of take you a little, elevate you more to the signal side and out of the noise and ignorance side, and share some of the thoughts of these panelists about where we're going in the future with cables. We're going to talk about a lot of things. We're going to talk about open networks. We're going to talk about mesh. We're going to talk about technology, capacity per pair, new ownership models. If we've got time, a lot of other stuff. Who's paying for all of this stuff? What's happening with OTTs? What's happening with carriers? So I'd like to introduce the panelists. And I'd like to introduce them in a little bit different way than we normally do. Instead of telling you their title and all that, I want to reflect on some of the announcements that they've made recently, which are indicative of some of the changes we see in the market right now. So, starting with Steve Grubb, he just came back from ECOC last week, and where he gave a paper and a seminar on some new technologies to increase the capacity per cable. Not necessarily per fiber pair, although some of it was per fiber pair, but also per cable. And of course, since he's from Facebook, he's part of the big announcement about Maria finishing construction last week. And then next, we've got Donald Tan, who's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the revolutionary things that have happened in China and perhaps even some of the cables that he's working on moving forward. Hiding behind him is, I think, Mike Constable, who will start loading the sail cable from Cameroon to Brazil from Huawei Marine. That's a big accomplishment, and he's going to start to do the shore-end work related to, in Mersing in Malaysia, related CX, just next month. Next, we have Paul Gabla from ASN. Everybody's seen all the wonderful announcements about CBRAS and the direct connection between Brazil and the US. Maybe even better than that from my perspective, he was recently quoted about the Vocus cable, ASC, going in, believe it or not, before the deadline. That's almost a first recently, isn't it, Paul? Yeah. And next we have Mike Grieger. Everybody knows Mike Grieger from TE Subcom. He, of course, was a party to the Maria announcement last week, an OTT cable, highest capacity open network on the market, just coming into service soon. Plus, TE Subcom announced that they're offering NOC services now. And last, but certainly not least, is Russ Matalich from RTI, who just put CUS into service, opening another new route across the Pacific. And he's starting the survey for HKG, connecting Hong Kong to Guam. And he's got JGA, Japan to Guam, to Australia in the plans and moving forward as well. So we've got a very esteemed set of panelists up here to share some of their thoughts with you about where we're going in the future. I'm a little bit concerned that a lot of the things we're talking about, Steve is going to kill me for saying this, is a little bit more evolutionary than revolutionary. So we're going to wrap up when we're done with all of the thoughts about what's going on now with where do they think we're going to be 5 years from now when SNW celebrates 25 years. So I'd like to start with my first question about ownership models. And anyone can start by answering this. A lot of the cables, as we saw, I was actually surprised by Alan's metric of 7% of the OTTs, because I think that a lot more money than 7% is going into the new builds from OTTs right now. A lot of the systems that I've been supporting have OTT involvement. And it seems to me that perhaps part of the challenge in getting these projects off is for the OTTs to find a new partner in developing a cable. And Russ has partners in some of his cables as well. So I'd like to ask the panelists, what makes a good partner in developing these new cables that are often co-builds now instead of the traditional consortium models in the biggest markets? Steve, do you want to start?
Okay, thanks, Elaine. Yeah, for a comment on that 7% number, I guess you were surprised it's low. I was surprised by that as well. And I think the key is publicly announced information. So there's a lot of us don't like to announce things until they're very far along. So in terms of ownership models, what works well, I can speak on Facebook's behalf for the ICPs. The other ICPs might have a slightly different opinion. But it works well for us to bring in just a few partners, and 3 is kind of the optimum number for us. We're doing 2 major projects, which are talked about now, Maria, where we have 3 partners, and PLCN, where there are also 3 partners. That's kind of ideal. And we choose partners with kind of complementary sets of skills that they bring to the table, or that, folks who don't compete with each other. So that's kind of the ideal thing. Although even competing with each other, you can argue that this is a fat pipe, and we're on the per fiber ownership model, where everybody does their own thing. They don't have to ask the others for permissions to upgrade, when they upgrade, how they do it, what the suppliers are. So it's kind of, they can do their own thing. And typically one of those partners will be the operator, and that's the ideal thing. We don't like to do that. We don't like to worry about the PFEs and when these alarms come and ship repairs. So typically an ideal will have one carrier or partner who will be the operator of the cable. So that kind of works out well for us.
So why don't you hand the microphone to Donald, and Donald, talk about partnering with the OTTs and how that works for you.
Yes. I do think this kind of the trend is very continue. For the OTT players, to play a very more and more important role in the submarine cable building, and especially in China we have another traffic generated from the OTTs. Now we can see the Microsoft, the Facebook, and the Google have played a lot of the investment in the submarine cable. So that they have the strong supporting of the fund, financial, and they have the unique requirement between their cloud basis, and they have the fundamental of the subscribers, and exactly, and they have the requirement for do everything for the investment of the submarine cable. So I do think this kind of the trend will be continue.
Russ, you have some experience in this regard.
Yeah, I'd add a few different things. Well, first of all, I'll try to speak plainly so to make it simple so people like me can understand. But what I think you have with cables, cables have to solve complicated problems. And those problems are commercial, technical, geopolitical. If they don't solve those problems, they're likely not worth building. But when we look at cables, we do them absolutely backwards. You can't build a cable without landing parties. So we have to start with landing parties, because if the landing parties, if you can't solve permitting or landing issues, there's no way you get your cable built. Once you have landing parties, then you have to have a supplier. Whoever your supplier is, it has to be a trusted supplier, someone that you can trust, someone that you know that you'll be able to do battle with, because building cables, as everyone knows, everything that can go wrong will, and quite often. Third, you have to have a great team. You have to have an outstanding team that has relationships that can reach through the market and solve complicated problems. And then finally, you have to be able to have access to money. But money's not the big issue. The issue is you have to be able to solve the permitting issues, start with landing parties, and then once you get to all that, the consortium parties. And the consortium parties should complement each other. Perhaps you have landing parties that solve problems on each side, people that don't take food off each other's plate that are part of the purchasing community. So it's a little bit complicated. I think you get to the consortium parties last, though.
I'd like to move on now to capacity pricing in the wholesale market. Alan and Steve, I think, both put up some charts that showed how technology was changing on a fiber pair over time, and how the split of capacity was shifting to the OTTs compared to the traditional market. A lot of the underlying factors that have supported capacity price declines over time, in my view, are diminishing. And since there are going to be fewer players, perhaps, in the market in each cable and less competition, I can't help but wonder whether capacity prices will level out a little bit, like Alan suggested. And I'm wondering what will happen to the wholesale market and what will happen to the carrier market. Does anybody care to tackle that one? Donald?
Yeah. I think for the as part of the carrier investor, the submarine cable want to take all of the effective in the this kind of the system. But now you can see this effect that the pricing is dropping a lot significantly, and I think this trend will continue. But you know that we have the bombing requirement of the traffic. According to CNN last afternoon's presentation, under 45% of each year of the traffic growing, and but just only 28% of the decline of the pricing, the wholesale pricing. So I think the pricing decline is because of the demand for the requirement for the competition. Sometimes it's for the swap, and you know that if the internet is increasing, the subscribers is increasing, traffic is increasing, I do think the investment will be effective. This is my comment.
Russ?
Well, I have no idea on price decline, and everybody can use the same averages, which are 15 to 20%. But if you look at the dominant owners, you have OTTs and then you have the others. The OTT's goal is to make transmission free, and they do so by swapping the traffic into other networks to solve other problems. The others want to keep prices as high as they can for as long as they can. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with OTTs or swapping. I think that's all good. You have to be loyal to your business model. Just that as that swapping continues, it will have a big impact on accelerated price decline.
Mike's got something to say. Please.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks. I think it ties together your two questions, right? If I look at the cost per bit and I look at the ownership model, I mean, you have to look at the derivative of what we're dealing with in the marketplace. How's the market changed? What is the function of the capacity? Right? We're getting to a commoditization of the product, of the utility value of that. You look at the Atlantic, you've certainly seen a rapid commoditization of it in that place, and we see that commoditization moving around the world into different markets, different routes. And so that ties back to the ownership model. What's the purpose of that commodity? Who's going to be selling it? Who's voting their capital in what way? We look at carriers moving investments away from certain types of infrastructure to mobile infrastructure. You look at what that means then in carrier participation on certain routes and in development. And in that, you see content players having a different purpose for it, but you know, it's part of offering the higher order services that are folded in with their data centers, and it's an infrastructure element that is being commoditized by them as much as the price erosion throughout the market. You then move into the gap of services that are required, and you look at the ownership. How and whom is providing the different services that used to be inside that ownership model on a consortium? Who's going to provide those services? How are they going to keep those cables operated? How are they going to maintain those cables? And where does that ownership model sort out in the future? And how does a carrier ICP relationship affect that ownership evolution? So I think those two questions are very related, because we are moving to a commoditization of the underlying asset, and then the ownership is morphing in order to move into such a model.
So what's the answer, Mike?
Say that again?
What's the answer?
Yeah, you told me that's our last question. I was going to tell you what happens in 5 years.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about data centers then, since you brought them up. Do you think given in the overall context of what you just described, do you see data center owners eventually becoming owners of cables as well to connect the data centers, like in a virtual campus across the oceans? Anybody want to take that on?
If I'll go on this. Yeah, I think it's a natural evolution for data centers to start investing in the connectivity infrastructure. I said that 2 years ago, and I think it's only a matter of time before we see a major data center player becoming an investor in a data center-centric system.
Anybody else care to comment? I mean, we've seen a little bit of that, but everybody tries to keep ubiquitous a little bit. Anybody else care to comment on this? Okay, so let's move to the technology side. since we're talking about cost per bit, Mike, you used that infamous terminology. I'm going to turn this first to Steve. What's revolutionary? And then to the system suppliers. What's going to be revolutionary to reduce the cost per bit? Mike's chomping at the bit.
Okay, well, I'll tell you, I guess, what's been revolutionary up to date, and then what's going to happen to keep that going. First of all, I would say that we actually have seen a tremendous revolution since the year 2000. I was calculating this recently, that actually the cost per 100G or 10G, you have to normalize it to one or the other, has decreased 2,000 times since the year 2000. Factor of 2,000, and that's been primarily because of coherent technology. And the capacity per fiber has gone up 20 times. So that's driven a lot of change in the industry. People say, oh, the fiber's new, and yes, that's correct, that's great, the large area positive fibers, but that's also enabled by dispersion. Coherent, because you can compensate for 200,000 picoseconds per nanometer, which was just unheard of 10 years ago. So I think coherent has driven the revolution in submarine and the new builds. So I think to continue that, though, we're going to have to, there was a lot of excellent suggestions at the end. We are approaching Shannon's limit, but Steve Alexander had a list of like 8 things that can be done there. And some of them are SLTE, like nonlinear compensation. So you just drive harder, you compensate more. So there's a lot of things that in the transmission that fall under the category of go fix your channel first. And so I think there's a lot of stuff there. But I think actually the revolution, we have to start seeing some changes in the wet plant. Like increasing the bandwidth, like PLCN is the first C+L system, that's great. So we have to see other things like that. So the innovation, I think, has to shift a little bit from SLTE to the wet plant. So you 3 slackers have to pick up the pace, I think, on that end. But
Yeah.
Well, yeah, actually, maybe I can comment on that capacity price decrease. And in fact, I fully concur with what Steve said about the 2000 factor, more or less. Actually, I think the big step change started even earlier than 2000, because really first you got optical fiber, then you got optical amplifiers, then you got WDM, and coherent was just like the 4th wave that contributed to that decrease. And in fact, capacity prices have dropped significantly, but so has the capacity of the system increased just conversely. So in fact, it's just because the technology has pushed so far that capacity prices have gone down. But then if we look at it from the carrier's point of view, what they pay for a given system is still more or less the same, except that it's much bigger in capacity, and then the unit cost of capacity decreases accordingly. But apart from that, I don't think there is much more to that. Now, what's going to happen in the next couple of years? So there are a couple of improvements that can come along, and Steve has described some of those. But really, in my view, right now we are still in a sort of incremental improvement. And then what's the next revolution? Well, it's anybody's guess, probably a couple of years away, but as Steve has hinted to, needs to parallelize everything. So it could be either the number of fibers, or increasing the bandwidth, or increasing the number of channels that you actually cope with. And that, of course, there is a lot of work going on in the labs on that, and I think in the next couple of years we'll see more of that.
Yep, don't mind.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that, because obviously there's a lot of talk in the industry at the moment about wet plant reduction in cost, and that can obviously be the hardware in terms of amplifiers or the cable, and there's a lot of focus now on new design cables, which is fine. Some of these are the bigger cost elements in a system, so yes, that's certainly something we can do to bring down cost. So there's 3 areas really. One is looking at our products, either cable or optical amplifiers. How can we strip out costs from that? From HMN's perspective, this year we've manufactured about 170 repeaters, which is more than we've ever done in the last 8 years. So we are actively stripping our cost out of our supply chain and strengthening our supply chain. On the back of that, we're starting to look at composite materials. So that's another avenue where you can take out incremental cost. But I think the other thing that we don't really explore as much as we could is the risk sharing, or the risk apportionment. So by that is, I'm talking about the sort of standard industry contracting model. I think that's got a lot of scope there to change. For example, Do we really have to survey the whole of the deep water of the Pacific, knowing in fact that there's probably one repair there every 5 years? For perhaps an OTT, Steve, like yourself, where over 70% of your traffic is machine-to-machine traffic, you're not selling wholesale capacity in the market. So perhaps some customers don't actually need a hard RFS date with penalties imposed, because these are the sort of standard models that allocate risk between the suppliers and the customer. Now, if we've got a flexible customer who may want to ease up on some of that risk or take some of that risk upon themselves, because we have a changing customer base, the models can change, there's another area where we can start to take cost out. Unfortunately, the whole world expects the internet to be free, but someone needs to pay for the infrastructure, and as we're at the bottom of the value chain there, we're the ones that get squeezed as our customers are getting squeezed.
Mike.
Thank you. Can we just step out of the cost element of it for a second, picking up on Steve's comment, right, is coming back to the ownership change, the shift of ownership is what is the fungible unit? What are people buying? And it's, we've been focusing on cost per bit. We have a C+L solution. We have C+C. We have a variety of solutions that increase the density on fiber. But we're seeing for the machine-to-machine, data center to data center, the proprietariness and the security requirements around owning and being secure about the ownership of that path. So that's moving us to a different fungible unit, fiber pairs. And so while as much as we've raced up the curve and offered products and solutions that increase the value density of bits per fiber, we also now have a competing paradigm that says I want security and therefore I want to own a fiber pair. So how can you give me secure fiber pairs that I can control? How can a Facebook fiber pair be controlled differently than a CT's from a Google's and the likes, and how can I get that security? And I might not need as high a density, but so we have dueling arguments here that want us to have multiple fiber pairs or fungible assets that give me the security while at the same time giving me the economics of ownership. So we have to not only look at the cost efficiencies of bits per fiber, bits per cable, but look at how are we delivering the fungible unit of a fiber pair on an underlying system. How do we make that system cost effective as we go forward? And we want to have that, that relationship between a bit and a controllable asset. And that's something else that we have to look at. And just to throw it out there is, it's also morphing into the technology and the commercial relationship of how are all these cables going to be managed? How are they going to be maintained? How is that going to match the cost efficiencies of getting all these bits in the water? What is the paradigm that's going to be managing all these extra kilometers? So it really comes back to, are we buying bits, are we buying kilometers, or are we buying fibers? And that's what I think is going to be driving the technology of the next generation and listening to the changing characteristics of the underlying owners who are buying from the suppliers.
So I may be putting somebody on the spot, but broadly speaking, I think everybody's looking at more fibers per cable right now on the supply side. How high do you think that will go? I know nobody's going to say what their product family is going to on the stage right now, how many they're going to have next year or the year after, whether it's going to be 12 or 16 or whatever. But what do you think is a reasonable maximum for the number of fiber pairs that you could possibly envision in a cable?
I'll take that first step at it. That again is an argument we see from our customers is the too many eggs in one basket. So while we're power limited in how many amps we're putting inside the repeaters, which is going to be required by how many fiber pairs we put in the cable, and we all have different capabilities to put different number of fiber pairs, but we're in that 8 to 12 type of zone. The argument comes back from customers is just what density do I want? How many threads do I want in the same cable? So on a particular route, let's say transatlantic, we're honing in between different customers on the 4 to 6, right? But that fits in with my network. That fits in with the mesh design. That gives me my SDN objectives that I would like and optimizes my economics on designing that. And so that is a counter argument to putting too many fiber pairs in one cable. My comments earlier was, how do I make those fiber pairs as cost effective, right? Increasing the one side of the fraction or the other can do that, but it's that argument that not too many so that I don't have too many eggs in one basket. How do I then make the fiber pairs as cost effective?
Paul, Mike, do you have any comment?
I would agree with Mike. So in fact, yes, there is a trend to increase the number of fiber pairs in the cable, and we have not reached yet the limit. So right now the trend is anywhere between 4 and 8, but of course more can be done. But then there is a question of route redundancy, which is a critical element these days, especially since now we are seeing again the emergence of, I would call them global networks. as opposed to before every carrier building its own route and somehow inserting that into a global network of a community of carriers. Now you see again, like, I don't know, 20 years, 15 years ago, some people building their own private or virtual private network anyway, wanting to control all the elements. And a big factor in that determination is to build into the overall network design a mesh network with sufficient route redundancy. And maybe I can pass the mic to Steve there so that he tells us exactly how many routes he wants. As far as we're concerned, the more the better.
Mike, your turn.
Yeah, obviously there's a trend to greater fibre count systems. We're responding to that with an 8 fibre pair repeater we're bringing out now. But I think that's also driven by another factor here, is we've gone away from the sort of standard RAU capacity sale to spectrum sales. So there's fibre pairs being sold or half fibre pairs. That's one of the drivers for a greater count. But also the fact that many people in a consortium or investors in a consortium actually want to take charge of their own destiny, and something that Steve referred to earlier. They want to have their own fibre. They don't want to mux their traffic or share that fibre with someone else. They want to have their own control over that fibre, their own SLT, their own upgrade path, etc., etc. So I think the ownership models is also changing that fibre count, that trend towards a higher fibre count.
This is a very interesting, and I want to come back to Russ, because Russ's network has a slightly different architecture than some of these big transatlantic and trans-Pacific meshes. But I'd like to ask Donald and Steve to comment on fiber pairs and mesh, and is it 4 or 5 or 6 routes? And is that different for an OTT than a carrier? So I'd like both of you to share your thoughts on that.
Okay. In terms of like number of fibers, first of all, like our data center work, people they don't tell us like how many fibers they need. They tell us what availability they need to that data center, how many terabits, and it's usually tens of terabits. And they started by saying, oh, well, you have to supply that if there's a submarine failure. And recently they started saying, well, you have to supply that in the case of dual failures. So I think the requirements are becoming more stringent for us to have a lot of route diversity. And again, the data center people don't care how we do it, but we're trying to think, especially in the APAC region, of making a more meshier network and having a lot of routes, fibers interconnected, and more clever cross connects. So it's not just a matter of how many systems you need, but it's a question of how clever you can make your fiber pairs behave in a nice mesh fashion so that you can get that availability target. So that's kind of the direction we're headed. It's definitely more fibers, but the interconnection part between the systems is becoming more important to us, especially with ROADMs. That's a big technology that's very promising for us.
Yeah. Donald?
I think it's very important for us to offer a very protected network. And I'm not sure that we have 4, 5, or 6 passes of the diversified route, but according to the requirement of the customer, and we need to protect the services. For example, in a couple of weeks ago, we had the shutdown of the submarine cable from Asia to Australia. You have the dual routes break down in the same time. So at this moment, you want to try to find another additional resources to recover the service for the customer. So for us, and it's a target to build up the very secure network for the customer, and we want to try to find additional resources. So this is for the carrier we can do. Yes, we want to serve our customers better.
Thank you. Russ?
Not much else to add except that really, the utilization of any cable is really a function of the population, the potential population it serves. So in our case, we're focusing on how many combinations can we provide that will allow other cables to be protected, and we're trying to do that in such a way that we're not competing on the primary routes, and mostly because it's not profitable to do so. To have more cables between Japan and the United States, or between Australia and the United States, there's a couple being built now, and so as we continue to focus on the non-commoditized routes, what we're trying to do is add optionality to port between cables, and because we have the economics and the ownership of all the various cables, we're allowing customers to move traffic in such a way they don't have to commit to one destination. They can take that one destination and route it over all of our cables.
So we've touched upon, I'm sorry, Steve, go on.
I just wanted to say one thing that I'd forgotten, that, again, we're looking at new routes to get geographical diversity, to go where cables have not been landed before, like Maria, between, Central Atlantic to Spain, PLCN, the first system for US to Hong Kong direct. And also so for more geographical diversity and hence, network availability things, but also taking a more proactive role in looking at historical data about where submarine faults have occurred and trying to do something about that in terms of rerouting. Like not every cable has to go through the Luzon Straits and things like that. So
You were the perfect lead into my next topic. So we've talked about diversity a little bit, we've talked about mesh, we've talked about new express routes connecting countries that weren't expressly connected before. There's still some new routes that people are talking about that have not taken off. Will anybody comment on how far people are willing to go to invest in some of the more unique routes? The most obvious one is the polar route as an alternate to a Eurasia route. Anybody? And you've got a lot of experience, Paul, in Alaska.
Yeah. So in fact, routes that have been developed so far are really the ones where there is the most traffic and probably the most economic viability. So these are the routes that have been developed for many years. And as we discussed before, on those routes, it's quite congested now. So capacity prices have dropped to all-time low. So on the transatlantic route, for example, is very well served. There are more like 20 cables crossing the Atlantic there. Some other routes are much less served, and some other routes are not served at all. So what we can see today is that we're moving in two directions. So one is that there are new players willing to develop a global network more than before. So that's what we discussed just before. Then another factor coming into that is that they are trying to connect demographics as opposed to just like business centers. So that creates a new demand even on routes that are maybe today marginally profitable from an economic point of view, but then it serves to connect people to the overall internet network. And you can even go as far as saying that you are sort of providing a public service to some communities where it's not just economics. So actually we are seeing a number of routes being opened in this way in some more remote parts of the world where actually there's going to be a component both of economic and private money, but also public money being invested there just to serve communities. So it's not a pure profitability issue, it's just connecting everybody to the network.
Mike.
Yeah, I think four factors come into play. It's volume, competition, diversity, and how it fits in with network's topology, meaning the customer's network topology. So if you look at that in volume, right, we look at how many systems we have across the Atlantic, the need for the diversity, how critical that route is, and how it fits into the POP / data center topology. Do they want that route? There are some routes that topologies have been defined, they're established, the DCs have been laid out, and the interconnect between these DCs to create the cloud and create the fabric that connects at the physical layer of these DCs are well established. The DCs serve a certain geographic area with a certain set of data, and so they want a certain topological design that allows that. Certain routes that are under consideration don't fall into that topology. So the challenge is they might offer certain uniquenesses, but at the same time they might not offer adequate advantage such to have them built. For example, certain routes fail the latency test. They fail the volume on the peer, the end point-to-point side. There might even be geographic diversity that someone wants to get away from a geopolitical issue or a pinch point in the network, but there's other ways to solve that. And I think those are some of the fringe networks, fringe projects that are on the edge that are coming closer and closer to actualization and being realized. but at the same time, they have the difficulty because they can't get that financial catalyst to get going. And so I think there'll always be those projects that are on the edge and eventually will take down more and more, but it's really, they have to fit into the topology of who the buyers are right now so that they can get access to the capital to get built. And I think the ones we've talked about for a decade now are the ones that just can't fit into that topology argument strong enough to get access to the capital.
Mike has the phone, and then we'll do Russ.
Yeah, I agree with Mike there. I mean, there is a data center-centric topology, and obviously we've got the existing data center players in that space providing the cloud services, but there's going to be new data centers coming along. So, you know, while the OTTs have their data centers focused in Europe, Asia, etc., one day there's going to be stuff in Africa, so that data center topology will keep changing. The other aspect is the economic sort of model which Russ is chasing. But then you sort of get the government service model to their citizens. Pull up a ring around Indonesia, for example. You know, connecting the smaller islands of Indonesia from a government investment perspective as a service to their citizens, as a right to access the internet. That's the other element.
Russ.
Yeah, I want to add on to that. I absolutely agree with Mike. The places like Indonesia are so underconnected when it comes to pulling together the population. But the one area that really frustrates me is the South Pacific Islands. I have no idea why the World Bank or other financial organizations can't work more closely together to do 4 or 5 different islands together at once. Every time you build a separate cable, you probably are adding another $20, $30 million of cost. So I think that that will be our big focus is over the next 12 months, along with the other 19 projects we have going on, is how do we work in concert with many of the people in this room to try to bring together 4 or 5 or 6 different island nations at once and find good sponsors, both financial and other economic ways to get cables built. But do them at once instead of coming back 5 times, because these cables get overlooked and they never get put into the queue. Cooperating closely with the suppliers so that you can build them more efficiently.
I'm going to change subjects somewhat. We can never escape a conference without talking about the cyclicality of our history. And somebody yesterday said the market is still cyclical. I think there may be some varying views on that now. I'd like to start, Steve, since Facebook's driving a lot of the new builds with you. Do you see this as a bubble, a hill, a plateau, a mountain? What do you see the current volume of systems that are being built now as the beginning of?
Yes, so a lot of people say that we're overbuilding systems, building too many. I disagree with that. I think we're going to keep building, perhaps even at an accelerated pace. I think there are new drivers out there that people underestimate. AI, VR, and augmented reality. For instance, AI requires a tremendous amount of bandwidth to learn more about you, your behavioral patterns, and like how a machine can help you in your daily life, what you need, anticipate what you need, for instance. And then VR, we talked. There's a lot of mention about how much bandwidth 4K video takes, but just think actually VR at 4K can take 20 times more bandwidth, because it's like 4K in each eye, 360 degrees. So I think those are new bandwidth drivers that are going to keep us investing in building, new submarine cables for the foreseeable future.
Donald, you're nodding your head. Do you have a thought on this?
I think that maybe some region have some overbuild, but for China Telecom, but ourselves, it's not enough for the bandwidth. Now you can see lots of the traffic growing from Asia, from China to the US, from Asia, and Asia from Asia to Europe. Although we have invested a lot of money in the submarine cable, but now, today, we can see more cables will come into China Telecom in the future. So this is, we can see the bright future for the submarine cable. And I do think, that for the subscriber in China, it's developing very fast. 20 years ago, we just think about the voice, the text message, but internet changed everything. Now today it's the data age, and you can see the internet changed everything, the life for every people in China. So the traffic is growing so fast, and we are running out of all of our resources, submarine cable now. So in the coming days, we can see more investment from China Telecom in this industry.
That's good news for the next three gentlemen. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to add something. So in fact, you're referring to a bubble, so I think everybody's referring to the same one we had a couple of, like 15 years ago. So at that time, traffic growth was predicated on people, just demographics, voice circuits, maybe, okay, a little bit of internet, but that was just the start. So it was really based on demographics. Now, what Steve's describing, the growth is not depending on the number of people, is depending on the applications you use that grow an order of magnitude. So I think comparing to the bubble we had last time, today I think the industry has become reasonable, between quotes, because we are talking here about a total market, I don't know, but if I look at the numbers, it looks like we are talking about 2 to 3 times smaller than the famous bubble that we're talking about. So I think it's reasonable and palatable.
Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. Absolutely agree. It's really about machine to machine. That's the driver of the big capacity nowadays. So I think we're in a sort of sustainable growth period. I don't see it being a bubble at all.
The other Mike.
Yeah, as someone who's been with Subcom for 17 years, this is a difficult question. I get this asked all the time. I really wish there was a more explicit, dependable, formulaic approach to how we could do it, right? If you look at the economic indicators and parameters of cars sold, right, or homes passed for a cable network, it's an easy thing, it's a more predictable capability, but we're in a violent change, right, of what is the metric that's driving these cables, right? VR, right? VR is the latest one. It was search, it was ad, it was video. Now we hear video, now we have 4K video. What are the metrics per homes passed, per mobile handset, right? What are these metrics that you can do? At a mobile, how many humans are there? How many mobile devices would each human consume? And you can do a predictable math and get to a saturation point. But what is the saturation threshold, right? What is that asymptote? What is that bound that we have? We're still exploring that. And the design, as Steve talked to, is how many routes are required to give the resiliency that you want for that. So no, I don't think we're in a bubble. No, I don't feel that we're at the end. Maybe we'll have a softening of the curve as this massive orders that we've all received are getting built out. But the desire for more and more of the population to get that resiliency, to get it at a cost-effective ability, and to consume more of the services being provided by people like CT and Facebook is without end right now that we see. Of course, the other metric is we had an argument that there's already too many Atlantic systems. But if you look at the systems that are being built and you look at how much capacity is being lit on day one, you can talk to the upgrade providers about that, the volume is incredible, right? So I don't know if I can give you the answer, but at this time, I don't know that we fully understand the formula that's going to allow us come to that answer.
Rusty, no comment. Okay.
No, I definitely have a comment, sorry. It's absolutely not a bubble, and you'll continue to see a lot of cables built. And the reason why is pretty clear, and I'm going to get some of these numbers wrong, so apologies in advance. China-US was built around 2000. It was about $1 billion, I think, for maybe 2 terabits. And then fast forward from 2000 to 2008-ish, TPE was built. I think that was probably 10 or 12 terabits for roughly 500 million. And now it's 2017. Last month we turned up CUS 20 terabits for 250 million. So you're looking at a reduction of maybe 75% of what it cost in 2000 to build China-US, but for 10 or 20 or sometimes 50 times the capacity. So it's the bubble was all about too much money and not being able to get a payback. Much different drivers now, and even protection back then was 100 years ago was about having 2 routes. You had to have a protected route, but now it's not 3, it's not 4, it's not 5. For these companies, maybe these like Facebook, the OTTs, and the incumbents, they need 5 and 6 routes, not just for physical redundancy, but geopolitical issues. And guess what? We're having more earthquakes and tsunamis and other weather events. So. Absolutely not a bubble, and cables will continue well into the future.
So can we wipe that word from our vocabulary? That would be nice, right?
I'm not going to say proliferation, no.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up now, and I'd like to start, Russ, with you and work this way. What do you think the most striking difference is going to be 5 years from now between today's undersea market and the one 5 years from now?
You mean besides big data centers being put in North Korea? I would say that you will see, I think you'll just see more closer cooperation among different companies that have nothing in common. And it used to be that the incumbents dominated all cables. And then it was the OTTs are coming in and taking over the world. And that's not the case. I think now it's just like our culture, even the purchaser groups are made up of very different companies from very different backgrounds. So I think you'll see just a very diverse purchaser group, and I think you'll see data centers and other connection points for cables in some weird places, places like Saipan and other places that might otherwise be overlooked as a potential place to interconnect cables. So anybody here from Saipan? Nope. Okay, well, places like that.
Mike?
Okay. I see two changes, right? For one is I'm not going to talk to the technology side, I'll talk to the commercial side because we have Steve and he can do quite a good job on the technology side. On the commercial side, right, I don't see a threat. I don't see a radical threat that's revolutionary to the players sitting on this panel. We're not building paper maps that are going to get replaced, right? Not building typewriters. What I do see, though, is a fundamental change in 5+ years from now is how the cables are owned. What is it that they're buying? Who's going to own these cables and how they're going to be operated? I think we're looking at a shift. We're moving into a commoditization of the underlying asset. It's going to drive a fundamental change in the ownership and the ownership economics and practices around the owning of the cables, right? We've already seen that step through the phases of people buying capacity or leasing capacity to owning fibers, to owning cables. In 5+ years from now, I think we're going to have, as we've had already, a changing profile of the ownership. We're going to have a substantial change in the ownership model in 5 years from now that fit into the role of an infrastructure element offering a higher order service. And I think that is what is going to just change the complexion of who's attending these conferences and who's sitting on these panels.
Paul?
Okay. Yeah. So in fact, I was surprised to hear where the industry is going to be in 5 years from now, because I thought you were going to ask 10, 15 years. Because the 5 years in this industry is tomorrow. Because the real changes that, I left the industry about 15 years ago, just came back last year. And in between that time and now, the only real change, just as Mike underlined, is the owners of the cables. So the OTTs didn't exist when I left. So Google just about and Facebook was created after I left. So in just 10 years, we have seen a sea change. And therefore, in 5 years from now, I think that model is going to mature. And as Mike described, we're going to see probably a different type of industry structure than we have today. Technology, of course, is going to continue to evolve. And probably in 5 or 10 years from now, we're going to talk about another 100 times something. But apart from that, it's really the economics and what drives submarine network development that is going to change. But who can predict?
Mike?
Yeah, I think two things. First of all is my customer base or our customer base. It's changing. If I look back to pre-2000, the number of organizations throughout the world, the telco companies, before the carriers came in, there was dozens of them. Deutsche Telekom was investing, AT&T was investing. The carriers in sort of the late 90s, 2000s took a lot of those guys out. To a certain extent, I see that evolution or revolution with the OTTs. If I look to Europe and to North America, how many of those traditional telcos are investing? Very, very few. Slightly different if I look to Asia, where arguably the markets aren't quite as liberalized. You're still getting the China telecoms, the Malaysia telecoms, Indonesian state-owned telecoms, they're still investing. So maybe there's a bit of a time lag there. But I think my biggest concern would be in 5 to 10 years is how many customers actually have I got anymore. Yes, we're going to get new ones coming in, Alibabas or other cloud services type people. So I think that would be my concern as a supplier. I think the second thing is security. I don't know how many of you are aware of the new Chinese cybersecurity laws that were implemented just earlier this year. And how is that going to impact suppliers building, maintenance providers are maintaining those systems, right down to the survey companies. What sort of data are they handing over? So as we are fundamentally an enabler of the world's being connected, we're seeing isolationist economic policies coming out in some parts of the world, which is inherently the opposite of what we're trying to do. I think that's going to cause us a big problem going forward, a challenge that we need to get together to solve.
Donald?
We have found lots of the things changed in the last 5 or 10 years, but we can expect that another things will be changed in the next 5 years, including the commercial technology. But I want to say here, most important for the people who involved in this industry, we want to have, we look forward for more effective progress of the project. We don't want to spend lots of time in the PPT project, but we want to spend the time in the real, to turn the ideal into the real project. So I look forward to the more efficiency.
That's an interesting comment. Steve?
Okay. So I think in 5 years, we'll see a validation of these new drivers, you know, AI-driven, VR-driven, AR-driven. So I think we'll see a validation of that traffic, and in fact, we'll see a new slope associated with that. We'll also see some new entities, you know, buying fibers or driving projects that you don't know of today or don't even exist today. So I think we'll see even new players, more new players coming into the market. And it's kind of a fun prediction. I'll say that I think in 5 years for Submarine Networks World, for the first time, you'll have an attendee option that's VR. That if you can't make the trip here, you can actually put on, say, an Oculus headset and attend the conference. You will be a 4K 360-degree camera over here recording the whole thing. So it's just like you're there, and you can actually even turn around and see people in the audience. Maybe some disembodied heads floating, because there are also VR attendees. And you can have a controller and like shoot a little laser beam at them and send a message, things like that. So VR attendee option, 5 years.
Beam me up, Scotty.
But I'm still coming to Singapore. I love Singapore. Forget that.
I've used my time. Graham, am I allowed one question, or are we cutting it off? One question from the audience.
Hello. Yeah, you talk about the growth of the demand, partly from the machine-to-machine and Internet of Things. Taking into account the technology of the catch, CDN, as well as the cloud, how will the growth of the M2M and IoT will contribute to the demand for the international capacity or cross-border capacity? You understand the question?
That's
Because
you, I think, Steve.
Not sure I fully understood the question. So how will it drive international bandwidth?
Because with the cloud and all the local capacity, local cache, local servers, the IoT and machine-to-machine, I found very little application that really require the international interconnectivities. So how would that impact the growth of the supply that you guys are talking about, the growth of the subsea cable requirement?
Okay. So a couple of comments is that, first of all, you know, Facebook has 2 billion users. I think, you know, most people realize that. And actually, there are 4 platforms now that 1 billion people log on to a day that are Facebook. You know, Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, WhatsApp. So they're outside the U.S., so that, you know, submarine communications is very heavily used there. I think also, though, we will grow international data centers. And actually, so there's, and we and a lot of the other TTs have a lot of redundancy in sending this information to data centers. And actually, you know, some of these data centers may have specialized uses, like, you know, for AI. We're going to say that, oh, Steve's brain is going to be controlled out of Luleå, Sweden, for instance. You know, Luleå, Sweden's going to do all the processing of his data and tell him, suggest things for him to do. So there are things like that that require tremendous amounts of data to transport internationally. And we even try to make it such that one data center can fail and the user experience is not perceived as being impacted.
Anybody else want to comment on? That's a hard question. I think a lot of people have asked that question. There is no real good answer that anybody's going to give you. So with that, I think we'd like to thank these great panelists for all the thoughts that they shared. Steve, Donald, Mike, Paul, Mike, and Russ. Thank you very much.